After doing this for the past couple of years, I suspect most of you might be familiar with this function. Okay, so I'm going to dive right into the agenda. We have 5 presenters today, each of whom have been given about 20 minutes for their proposals, followed by a 10-minute Q&A. We have a brief pause, and this will likely be later because we started late. We have a brief pause at about 2:55. We'll resume again at 3:05. There's also a slight change in the agenda in that I believe Mary Lynch of Constellation will be providing some highlights of Aram's proposal. If we have questions that run over each segment, we can save them for towards the end of the workshop when we'll have a final Q&A session. We've built in some time for the workshop, so we should have enough time to answer most questions. And for those who are presenting, as I mentioned, maybe in an earlier email, I will take care of advancing the slide deck. So feel free to give us a verbal prompt if you want us to forward or rewind your presentation. So with that, I'll get into some background and the reason for the workshop. In June last year, the Commission adopted a central procurement entity structure for the procurement of resources in RA. And under the framework, LSEs can both sell and or show their resources to the CPEs. This was then followed by the Commission adoption of a LCR RCM in December 2020. And in spring, the CPEs conducted their first local procurement for compliance years 2023 and 2024. And most recently this month, the assigned office issued a scoping memo and ruling that divided the proceeding into an implementation track and a reform track. The implementation track is further subdivided into phases 1, 2, and 3. Under the phase 1 track, which is what we're discussing now, or what we're under, the Commission is to consider modifications to the CPE structure. Okay. So under this phase 1 implementation track, the Commission is to consider refinements to the CPE structure for the following specific issues. First, the implementation details of the shown resource components of the framework. Second, the CPE should be allowed to procure local resources outside of the annual, whether the CPE should be allowed to procure resources outside of the annual all source process. And then third, whether there should be any changes to the existing CPE timeline. And finally, whether the Commission should reconsider modifications to the requirement that PG&E and SCE bid into their UOGs and contracted resources into the solicitation at their levelized costs. And here I've just thrown up a slide on some of the current schedule for phase 1. These are intermediate deadlines so that a final decision that concludes phase 1 can be issued in March of 2022. So this means that the parties' proposals were due yesterday, followed by the workshop today. And in recognition that parties may need additional time, the ALJ for new or revised proposals are to be filed on December 23rd. Comments on all the proposals and this workshop are due on January 4th, with reply comments due on January 13th. This will then be followed by PD on February 1st. With that, I'll now hand it over to Simone Brandt, who will discuss the first proposal from Energy Division, followed by Emma Eng, who will discuss the second proposal for Energy Division.
So our first proposal has to do with how the calculation for the compensation mechanism for LSEs that self-show new preferred or storage resources in local areas. So as it was laid out in the decision last September, we would use the PCIA price data request to calculate the system and local weighted average prices, and the difference would be what we used for the LCR RCM. And then for the first year, in the second year, we would continue to use the PCIA data for the system price, but use the weighted average just of CPE solicitation results for the local prices. So energy division, go to the next slide. We don't feel that it's possible to implement the decision for the subsequent years as it's laid out due to limited CPE RA only contracts in local areas. For a variety of reasons, a substantial amount of the resources were self-shown by LSEs under the hybrid CPE structure. There are also quite a few contracts that include energy settlement or put option, which can't be compared directly to the RA only contracts in the PCIA price data. And then additionally, there's more procurement needed for 2023 in PG&E's service territory. As a result, we're proposing to continue to use the same structure that we used in year one for the LCR RCM calculation. The PCIA data does include the CPE RA only contracts as well as any other contracts signed by LSEs in the local areas. This will give us a large enough data set to continue to have an individual price point for each local area while maintaining confidentiality with the contracts. So are there any other questions, or should we move on to our second proposal? Don't see any, so Emma?
Hi, everyone. I'm Emma Ng. I'm new to the RA team. Prior to joining the commission, I completed my undergraduate at UC Berkeley. So for some background on our second proposal, in decision 2006-002, the commission largely kept the existing RA timeline and made some slight modifications to account for CPE procurement. First, LSEs in each TAC area would commit to show their self-procured local resources to a CPE. Then in late September, both CPEs and LSEs that committed local resources to the CPEs would submit their local RA showings to the commission and to the CAISO. Then around late September or early October, Energy Division would send out CAM allocations to LSEs so they could use them in their late October year-ahead filings. Can we get the next slide, please? So in reviewing this, Energy Division identified an issue with the current timeline. The system and flexible CAM credits that are distributed to LSEs are tied to end of September CPE filings. Given that these credits could alter an LSE's year ahead position, Energy Division believes that there isn't currently sufficient time for LSEs to finalize their year ahead RA positions. Next slide, please. Thank you. To address this issue, Energy Division is proposing a modification to the RA timeline. This change would move up the late September CPE filing to late July so that we can allocate credits sooner. With this change, Energy Division would send preliminary CPE allocations to LSEs in mid-August and then send out revised allocations in mid-September as part of the final year-ahead LSE allocations. This would all feed into the year-ahead showing submitted at the end of October by LSEs and CPEs. Thank you.
This is Jamie with Energy Division. Do we want to pause here for just a minute or two, and if anybody has questions before passing it over to PG&E for their presentation? It looks like Noah and Matt both have their hands raised. Why don't we go to Noah and then Matt?
Hey, this is Noah Tom from Middle River Power. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
On proposal 2, I just wanted to get clarification whether or not the Energy Division is making any adjustments to the CPE RFO sort of timelines, whether it's one or more than one RFOs prior to the late July proposal here.
So I think that we're continuing, like, as laid out in the proposal that was circulated through the ALJ ruling yesterday. We're proposing to keep the RFO, the CPE RFO flexible, like a flexible timeline there. And I think the way that we had understood the first decision was that it provided the flexibility for the CPE to have more than one RFO to meet the requirements. And so really the flexibility of when the CPE starts its RFO is not defined.
Sorry, what?
We would be removing the kind of requirement or the specificity about when an
Oh,
LC
who's
is
presenting
required.
us is PG&E.
I'm
I don't
getting
know who it is.
somebody's unmuted. Natalie, you're unmuted.
I think it's Brett. I think, or
Natalie.
Matt.
So we would be removing the requirement, or at least the language around it, when the LSE is supposed to self-show to the CP prior to the RFO. So there wouldn't be a specific time defined around that. And then in addition to that, we'd be moving up the compliance filing date for the CPE from the end of September to the end of July to allow for more time for allocations to be sent to LSEs and then absorbed, in their procurement decisions.
Okay, thanks for that.
And then let's go to Matt. I'm not sure if it's someone. Are you unmuting?
Oh, hey, can you hear me? This is Matt. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Matt Barmack with Calpine. I had a question about the first proposal, and maybe this reflects my ignorance of what's in the PCIA price data, but it was a little bit unclear what additional transaction data you're proposing to use to calculate the LCR RCM. And I guess it's unclear to me, like, what non-CPE transactions would actually be for local RA and say have the same substitution requirements as local resources procured as local RA. I mean, would you just be looking at transactions for local resources, or would you be looking at actual local RA transactions? I guess that's what I'm asking.
It's any transaction in a local area, whether or not it's going to be used for a local RA or system or flexible.
So Natalie, could you go back to proposal A? We're getting requested in the chat to go back to that slide.
We get all RA only transactions in the PCIA data.
Yeah, and I guess my concern about that is not every RA transaction for a local resource is a local RA transaction.
So is the pricing different if it's not going to be used for local RA?
Yes, it's potentially different.
Do you have any suggestions?
I don't have any great ideas, but I think calculating the premium this way could be misleading potentially.
If it is a self-showing resource, then it is being used for local RA, even if it's procured mostly for system.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'll think about it a bit more, but this did raise some concerns for me.
Thanks.
So, I mean, this is Jamie. I mean, the other way that it could be kind of revealed, because I think there's a, requirement that this LCR price come out prior to the RFO, the CPE launches, so that LSEs can make a decision about whether they are going to self-show or bid in. And so, because the decision requires that we use the CPE data from the last CPE, procurement that was done, and that data needs to be kind of provided at an RA price level, because, when you include, energy settlements or RA puts in that, it changes the value. And so we would have potentially very limited data for some of these local areas where we didn't see a lot of transactions. And so in order to arrive at that premium price, I mean, we could just limit we could limit what we provide, just providing the premium. We wouldn't provide it by, we wouldn't provide the local area price, average price, weighted price. We would just provide the net between the local area price and the average price, average weighted price.
Okay, yeah, I mean
And another way of getting around it is to aggregate further. So I mean, we don't want to aggregate further, because then you kind of lose the local premium in those sub areas that are constrained. But that would be another way of getting around confidentiality concerns.
yeah, I mean, so under either of those approaches, if I recall correctly, like Edison procured one resource in their first CP RFO. So I guess you would have like one data point essentially, and you might apply it to both local areas in Edison.
Yeah, I guess.
We could probably just say for all of Edison, it's 3 cents or whatever, because we couldn't tell you at what price.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Well, yeah, I mean, but you could back into that contract price, right? Well, I guess you couldn't. If you didn't know the weighted system average price that was used from the last, I think it's 4 PCIA data requests, which I don't think is public. I think it's the PCIA benchmarks are based on kind of a different set of PCIA data requests, correct, Simone?
Yeah, it would be a somewhat different cut at the data. Although I don't know how different it is.
All right, well, thanks for the question, Matt. And, feedback is helpful here, so.
Now,
Why don't we go to Eric?
Yeah, go to Eric. Yeah. You're unmuted, Eric.
Okay, that was interesting. I think I should be unmuted now, I hope.
Yes, now we hear you.
Okay, good. So the question that I have is back on your slide about the timing, and maybe you said it and I just simply missed it, but what period of showing are we talking about here? Because you've got a 3-year forward showing where it's supposed to be 100% for years 1 and year 2. And right now we didn't meet the 100% requirement for what would have been the second year. Does this mean then that for the procurement for 23, that in 2022, LSEs aren't going to know their final CPE allocations until September? Is that what's being proposed here, or is this only being proposed for 24 and beyond?
So hopefully this answers the question. Okay. So let's just use the procurement that's been done for 2023 and 2024 already as our example here. So come July, LSEs would receive an initial allocation of that CPE procurement that's been executed by the CPE and reflected in the advice letters that were filed. That would be part of the initial July allocations. But given that there is still existing procurement that needs to be done for 2023 and 2024, I think what we're trying to do here is get those allocations earlier to LSEs because they need to plan for their 2023 system position. And so you get your first allocations in July of CPE procurement, and then in August, you'd get another allocation of the additional CPE procurement that was done in this year's CPE RFO. And so that would be locked in. Now, what usually changes between the July and September filings is really supposed to reflect just the changes in load forecast, like the load ratios change. So there's this update that LSEs can make to their load forecast in August. And so the load ratios get refreshed, and then they flow into the final allocations in September. So, I mean, there could be small changes between the information received in August, accumulated with July, but we're trying to get the bulk of that, captured by August, and it would just be load ratio changes to CPE procurement that the LSEs would be managing starting in September. Hopefully that makes sense. Long-winded way of saying it.
Yeah, okay, I think I understand. I think CalCCA will touch on this point in their presentation later. Thank you.
It looks like Rhett has a question, and I still see Matt. I don't know if you have another question or if your hand is up from before.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks. So I guess more of a clarifying question, kind of moving up the timeline. So, and it sounds like the commission may have to consider a separate CPE track every year, so that if there's any structural changes or any modifications to the hybrid structure, that we need to get a decision completed or adopted every February or March. That's somewhat of a safe assumption then.
I'm not following the logic of why we would need a CPE track. Okay. So the thinking here, Red, is that because if we want any type of changes to flow into the CPE framework, we have to adopt something earlier in the year to account for that. Like we do like a June decision so that we can implement for our current RA framework, but with a CPE framework, it has to get earlier. It has to be pushed up earlier because the RFO starts, the whole process starts earlier. Is that the logic?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that as a potential thing, but hopefully we don't need changes every year.
Hopefully. Oh yeah, that's the only item I had to comment on.
I'm not seeing any more hands raised, Simone. Do you see anybody?
Rhett, are you presenting for PG&E?
Yes.
I do see a question from Doug Carpa, though. Do you see it, Simone? Actually, I'm seeing quite a few
I see a
questions.
question from Noah in the chat.
Okay.
Would proposal A impact the LCR RCM for 2023 or start in 2024? Could additional procurement in 2022 for 2023 potentially resolve the lack of pricing for 2024 plus? We need something that could be implemented for next year. You know, I believe this year we put out the pricing in March, and we'll need to. This will be the second year, so we need something that we can implement basically immediately after the CPE decision. And I guess, you know, in terms of the future, we don't know whether you know, there would ever be adequate contracts to implement as it was laid out or not. It all depends on the amount of self-shown resources and the energy-only contracts. And given, particularly in PG&E's territory with so many quite small local areas, whether they would ever all be covered with an adequate number of contracts, it's unclear to me anyway. Do anything, Jamie? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're trying to provide some more clarity around just how we should handle kind of this gray area. And I threw out kind of another option, which is, you know, the aggregation or the potential, you know, just showing the local premium price and not reflecting what, you know, the system price, the weighted system averages or the local area prices for these local areas would be one way of doing it. I mean, if you didn't have any contracts in a local area, then, I mean, would you then have we just have a zero premium price because you didn't have any contracts reflecting that area? So these are just things that we'd like everybody to struggle with and think about and weigh in on. Maybe, you know, alternative proposals would be welcome.
Not seeing any further questions, so I think we can move on to PG&E's presentation. Brett, you're a panelist now, so you can unmute yourself.
Okay, thanks. So good afternoon. My name is Brett Kikuyama, and I'm in the Market and Procurement Policy team at PG&E. And I'll be highlighting really 4 of PG&E's initial phase 1 proposals that were filed yesterday. I'll add that these proposals are subject to change based on the feedback received within this workshop, and any revisions to these proposals PG&E plans to submit on the 23rd. There are 2 proposals within the filing that we did yesterday that I do not plan to go into great detail on, and those are the expansion of the CPUC procurement authority and the confidentiality. So on this slide, you have proposals 1 and 2. They're really tied to more of the rate making and cost recovery. And then proposals 3 and 4 are tied to some of the lessons learned from the 2021 CPUC process, which will try to provide a little more information. And so we have here proposal 1, PG&E requests for guidance that CPUC transactions for UOG and IOD contracted resources should not have the underlying contract be reclassified to CAM from their authorized cost recovery mechanism, such as PCIA. The second one, proposing that the CPUC procurement cost should be forecasted in rates to the annual forecast proceeding. Third item, PG&E proposes that the Commission direct the bundled arm of the IOU to file a Tier 2 advice letter proposing methodology for bidding UOG and IOU contracted resources in the CPUC process. And then the last one, which has a little more detail, a little more weedy, is proposing to eliminate the requirements to execute an agreement for self-shown resources and adopt a binding notice of intent and CAM-based crediting approach. So next slide. Okay, so first proposal, this is somewhat of a 3-part proposal. So first bullet states, PG&E is requesting clear guidance that CPE transactions for IOU resources should not have the underlying contract be reclassified to CAM from their authorized cost recovery mechanism. So in other words, the IOU resources would not have their underlying contract reclassified to CAM if that CPE transaction is only for the capacity attributes. I think within the decision language, it talked about reclassifying IOU resources. What we're saying is any transactions are really only tied to the capacity attribute, then that's when it should not be reclassified to CAM. The next part of the proposal involves sales through the CP of IOU resources. So it says only attributes identified within the CPE agreement as being sold to the CPE should be recorded as purchase volumes and costs within CAM. So we have here, if you go to the third bullet point, so kind of attributes sold to the CPE from IOU resources really should be treated similarly if PG&E were selling those same attributes to another LSC. So, for example, an RA sale from a PCI eligible resource to the CPE would be presented similarly had that RA sale been done to another LSC. And then the last part of the proposal involves treatment of self-shown IOU resources, which is captured in bullet 4. And what bullet 4 is really indicating that self-shown IOU resources will not be reported as a sale to the CPE because these resources are being retained for bundled use, should not have cost recovery and go to. So I'll stop there on proposal 1 and let me see if there's any questions. Yeah, I'm not seeing any. Okay, the next slide. Yes. Okay, so hoping proposal 2 is
We had a question from Eric.
go ahead.
Hey, Red, just real quick on your first slide, can you talk a little bit about if PG&E as a load serving entity were to sell a resource to the CPE, what are you going to credit to PCIA? Is it the benchmark or is it the price that you sold it to the CPE at?
The price you're selling it to the CPE.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Any other questions? Okay, so the next slide. So sort of in line with proposal 1, given that only transactions involving sales of the RA attributes. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to read the first bullet. So PG&E is proposing that the procurement costs would be forecasted and implemented in rates through the annual error forecast proceeding. And so in that same vein, given that only sales would be transferred to CAM, impactful to rate making, we're suggesting or proposing that that information would be part of the work papers impacting or outlining sort of the impact to rates. However, any transactions, again, because they're not of self-shown resources, because they are being retained by the IOU and will not be part of CAM, that would not be part of any supplemental or confidential chapter within the error forecast. So slightly, little more straightforward as far as this proposal. Any questions?
I do see a question in the chat from Mary.
That should be when.
I think that was actually for me, so, or for energy division. So we can leave that for, sorry, we can leave that for maybe the Q&A at the end. It does look like Scott Olson might have something. Simone, do you see that?
Yeah, to answer your question, so Scott is asking to clarify on proposal 1, a PCIe resource that is sold to the CPE would still have a system RA-CAM allocation, and that's correct. Next slide. Okay, to be responsive to parties' requests, PG is providing some lessons learned from the first CPE process. But before we kind of dive into some of these items, we wanted to highlight that PG does not take the confidentiality of market-sensitive information lightly. So as a result, we will be discussing some items sort of as the lessons learned, and these items are really specific to offers or resources or counterparties. Also, what the CPE's position is in specific local areas. I think it's been provided at an aggregate level, and then any really specific details on how the CPE evaluates its resources or its methodology. And then lastly, any decision making on when or when not to defer to. So with that said, we'll try to provide as much information as far as lessons learned. So I think as other presentations have outlined, there was a lack of presentation and lack of interest in contracting in the inaugural 2021 CPE process. And again, that covered procurement years 2023 and 2024. I'll highlight that PG as a CPE received insufficient offers, both self-shown and bidding to meet its 2023 allocated RA requirements. And some of the potential drivers that we see is that LSCs that were eligible to self-show perceived that the benefit of self-showing resources was not worth the contractual risk associated with committing that resource. Second one is that resource-specific procurement, which was needed to meet the overall hybrid structure and some of the objectives, are more restrictive than how the current market transacts. So, for example, LSCs do not necessarily have access to resource-specific information, which the CPE had requested to evaluate the portfolio. I think historically, or at least currently, the market has been primarily transacting for generic RA, and a lot of the information that was requested was not necessarily part of any contracts. I think it required LSCs to reach out or kind of look for that information. Market participants have alternate markets for their local capacity, especially with the current system RA market dynamics. And what this means is that because local RA no longer has a premium in the market as compared to system RA, participants may have other venues to monetize on their capacity. I will say, sort of in that same vein, given that the CPE is procuring well in advance of LSC's system showings, there could be an inherent option value of hanging on to the capacity and not committing it to the CPE until the year prior. So I think those are really the three main items we're kind of looking at. Item 2 maybe a market or transitional issue as the market adapts to kind of the information needed. And 3, maybe a reflection of the current market conditions where overall the RA market is tight in general. PG is open to additional feedback in this workshop, and I think we put forward 2 proposals to potentially address some of the issues experienced on the lack of participation, lack of interest from the CPE process. And so in general, looking for feedback from the market. Maybe I'll stop there. question.
Question from Noah.
Hey, Red, this is Noah from Middleware Power. Just a couple of questions for follow-up. How did you come to the conclusion that there was lack of interest in contracting with PG&E? Is it purely from the sort of supply that was shown, self-shown and or offered to the PG&E?
So it was really based on some of the market feedback was sort of when the CPUC solicited some of them.
Hey, Rat, this is Jamie. I'm having a little hard time hearing you, and I did get another note in the chat that somebody else is as well. Would you be able to repeat that or speak into the mic a little bit louder?
Okay, let me adjust my setup. Is that better?
Yeah, that's better. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah. Hey,
So-
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Noah.
I think I heard you say something about feedback from a survey.
Right. But I mean, other than that, I cannot go into any confidential information or specific to like a resource or counterparty.
Right. No, yeah, I'm not asking for sort of that specific information. Just trying to go down into sort of the lack of participation. My sort of read, and tell me if I'm wrong here, that then PG&E may not have elected to defer procurement, or that there was still more resources offered to PG&E CPE.
I'm a little confused. So is it more of, I guess, is it related to the second bullet that we see insufficient offers? Or are you asking if there were more offers?
Yeah, you just trying to figure out if you said there's insufficient offers. If I'm trying to figure out what happened, does insufficient offers mean PG&E didn't defer procurement to CAISO, backstop?
Oh, so two things, right? CAISO backstop couldn't occur until, at least for 2023, until next year.
Okay.
I think, Rat, maybe you could clarify what insufficient offers means here.
Okay, so in the aggregate, for both self-shown and bidding, they were not sufficient to meet the requirement.
So are you saying that the total offers offered in were insufficient to meet the requirements?
Correct.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's some room between how much PG&E procured and was shown relative to the local RA requirement for 2023. Just trying to figure out if there's any sort of deferred procurement, not reasons as to why, but rather just if there's any room there.
I mean, so you think, right, on the last bullet, the CPE team does have another opportunity to secure capacity. So I'm not necessarily sure I'm following the question about making the deferral to CAISO at this point.
Well, I guess my question would be whether or not PG&E CP viewed 2021 procurement as and 100% requirement as a mandate, sort of, to meet an obligation, or did it feel that it could this is sort of its first shot, and granted, I understand that, that it had another opportunity later on to get to that procurement obligation.
Oh, I mean, so the CPE team will make reasonable efforts to procure additional capacity. So I don't think it's viewing it as, that earlier this year was its one time effort or its only opportunity.
Okay, thanks.
Were there any other questions?
Oh, hi. This is Mary. Did you unmute me?
Yes, Mary, we can hear you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had a question back on the survey that Noah was asking about. So, and I understand that you can't give any specifics, but who was the survey? Was the survey just sent to, who was it sent to?
Mary, let me see if I might have to defer to Mark on some of he's on the CPE team. On who
Can we
exactly
make him a
was sent to.
panelist, Rhett?
Sure. Oh, he indicated the survey was sent to all market participants.
I tried to unmute him, but I don't think he doesn't want to talk.
To all market participants. Does it, I don't know what that means. Was it sent just to people who had resources to offer, or to everyone who's a party to this proceeding, or what does that mean?
Yeah, so Mary, this is Mark Emergency with PG&E. I can jump in here. Sorry, I'm having trouble getting off mute there. In terms of sending to all market participants, typically with any market notices that PG&E CP sends out, we do have a broad distribution list that includes a number of market participants. Includes folks who are active in the RA markets, also other developers or generator parties as well. So that was really the list of folks that we sent it out to.
And so is that the same list that you would have sent out the notice for people to submit bids, for parties to submit bids into the, when you were soliciting bids for the local requirement? Was it the same list, or was it a broader list?
Yeah, Mary, it was a similar list. I can't say it's exactly the same list, but I do believe there were some folks added after the fact, but it was largely similar.
Okay, and then on the question of deficiencies, when you say they were deficient because they didn't meet the requirements, do you mean the deficiency was in the quantity of bids you got, or other elements that it didn't meet, like pricing, like the pricing was outside some bounds that you expected to see prices in? Or could it be all of those things that led you to not accept certain bids? Or were there just simply not enough to meet the quantity?
Look, Mary, there were not enough.
So there weren't enough megawatts offered for you to meet the overall local requirement?
Offered and self-shown.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Go to Greg Klatt.
Thank you. Hi, this is Greg Klatt for Western Power Trading Forum. I'm frustrated as a practitioner and trying to figure out what happened with PG&E, and I'm also probably didn't help that the stress of trying to log on to the workshops. So if I sound a little irritated, I apologize in advance. It's nothing personal. But the elephant in the room here is that PG&E was short by over 4 gigawatts in some months and more than 6 gigawatts in other months. That's a huge shortfall. I think it's unprecedented. And we as stakeholders are trying to get a handle on why that's the case. And I understand, I'm very sensitive to the concerns about market sensitive information. You know, as a trade association, we're very careful to steer well away from price information when we discuss regulatory issues. We probably go farther than's needed to make sure that we don't run afoul of any trust concerns. All that being said, I have to say that this list of potential drivers is just not helpful. We don't know if you were shown, if PG&E was shown, you know, 3 additional gigawatts in those months where it's 4 gigawatts short, or if they were, you know, if the 4 gigawatt shortfall is just due to not being shown enough stuff. We need some sort of quantification or qualification, maybe, if we don't even want to get into that specific. You know, the primary driver was A, a secondary driver was B. Without that information, and this is addressed to the Energy Division, we as stakeholders simply cannot provide you with informed proposals to try to address which was obviously a disaster for PG&E's CPE procurement for this initial cycle. So if you can provide, Rhett or someone on your team can speak to that and provide some more detail to where we feel that, okay, now we have an idea of what the bogey is, what's the target, what was the big problem, we can focus on that, and then maybe what the secondary problem is and focus on that. And that's the end of my rant.
No, thanks, Greg. I understand the frustration, sort of issue you guys, you know, some of the market participants. I think we are trying to work with parties. You know, I will highlight that at least one item that we've tried to address is the self-showing aspect. So that is an item that we think, you know, parties or at least may help with participation issue. But sort of, you know, being mindful of me not being able to go in some of the confidentiality aspects. I do kind of understand the frustration.
Okay, that I understand what you're dancing around, Rhett, and I'm sensitive to that. But we need to know as stakeholders what the driver was. You weren't shown nearly enough resources to get even close to your targets, or was it that we were shown enough resources to get close, but there was a big chunk of those resources that were over, you know, what we predetermined was an unreasonable mark. We have to know that information to know where to make adjustments to the program, because those are all parts of the program. We have to talk about price in some way, shape, or form so we can wrap our head around that. And we have to talk about quantities in some way so that we can, again, be informed. Otherwise, at this point, it's just Energy Division staff and the PG&E CPE that knows what happened. And then that also assumes, I'm assuming that in the PG&E CPE compliance report, that you did provide sufficient information in the confidential version so that staff can have a good idea of what happened. We don't know that as stakeholders because so much information was redacted from the public version. We're steering blind here, and it calls into question the whole purpose of this workshop and this process if we can't get down to the bottom of what happened.
I understand. I mean, I will add that there is non-market or reviewing representatives from market participants can review the information.
The driver here is system prices. That's the driver for what's happening in the RA market. The market participants are well aware of what market pricing is at for system because they're in the market. So I'm a little bit baffled about how close PG&E is playing things, how close you're playing your cards to your chest, because there has to be some middle ground between what I've described and what could potentially have an impact on CPE procurement cost, and on the one end, and on the other end, the way that PG&E is presenting or not presenting information that's helpful for stakeholders to do a forensics on what happened in 2021 and what can we do in the next couple of months to potentially have a chance to fix things for the 2022 procurement cycle.
This is Jamie, Greg. I just want to maybe ask, what specific information would you like to see? I mean, PG&E is saying they did not receive sufficient offers to meet their requirements, and that would include both the self-shown and bidding. I guess they're not releasing information that says of those insufficient offers, how many they ended up procuring. But I mean, like, what additional information are you asking for that would be helpful for you to better understand how to fix kind of the problem that?
I think one piece of information would be what's the delta between the shown and offered resources, bid resources, and the procurement requirement. Ideally by local capacity area. And then if PG&E believes that would create a problem, to please be specific in explaining as to why that would create a problem, providing that information on an LCA by LCA basis. So that's one piece. And then a second piece of information that would be helpful would be of the resources that were offered into the RFO, the total megawatts, here's how many megawatts we didn't award bids to because we felt that the bid prices were too high. That's some pretty basic information that doesn't necessarily reveal prices, but allows stakeholders to wrap their heads around, okay, what were the primary drivers? Then we can think about what are potential solutions to those drivers.
I mean, I think also, the fact that they didn't get sufficient bids into their RFO shows that, at least in my mind, it reflects kind of this tightness in the system market that's happening and that transition to the CPE.
Yeah, but there's a big difference between overall we were 500 megawatts short in terms of what was offered and shown and what our targets were, as opposed to overall we were 3,000 megawatts short. If you take we were 3,000 short in terms of even having enough resources shown or offered to us to get to our target. You see what I'm saying, Jamie?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is you want to see what was left on the table and understand why.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
And I think PG&E might have to take that back and think about, what they feel comfortable releasing from a confidentiality perspective.
Thanks, Jamie.
Okay, at this point, I'm just going to step in and let PG&E know you have until about 2:30. Let's see, we started late, so yeah, if we could move through the next couple of slides. Are you on, Brent?
Yes, I'll try to go through them. So proposal number 3, PG&E is proposing that the Commission directed on the procurement arm of the IOU to file a Tier 2 advice letter proposing its methodology for bidding and UOG and contracted resources in the CPE process. So the CPE decision has directed the bundled procurement arm to bid its resources at their levelized fixed costs. And that was defined as the annual revenue requirement for UOG or the contracted price for PPA. Again, this requirement is specific to when the bundled arm would participate in, I guess, the CPE's arm of that same IOU solicitation. So one of the lessons learned is that this could present a barrier to participating in the solicitation, as there really is no, at the moment, commission-approved methodology to parse out some of these individual components of the resource. So for example, we have here the contracted price of a resource, maybe 100 megawatt hours, and that could be all inclusive of that resource attributes, such as RA capacity or renewable energy. So arguably the bundled procurement arm could bid its entire resource and its attributes in the CPE process. However, it's not clear that the CPE has authority to procure those attributes, and the current CAM mechanism does not allocate any non-RA attributes to benefiting customers.
Brett, if you could also speak up, by the way.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. Thanks.
Okay, proposal number 4. I'll try to go through this quickly again, so I apologize. So overall, I think PG&E believes that a binding mechanism is needed to ensure performance for self-shown resources. And so the LCR RCM decision had adopted a requirement for contractual agreements to sort of serve as the binding mechanism. And I think when we refer to performance here, we're talking about that one of the obligations that an LSC has would be to submit its self-shown resource to the CAISO as an RA resource. And this is really an expectation or assumption that the CP is relying upon when conducting its overall evaluation. So again, kind of going to the second bullet point, the requirement for a contractual agreement is intended to ensure performance. And without a contract, CPM costs due to non-performance of the LSC would be socialized or have to be socialized across all CPE benefiting customers, which could result in a cost share. So PG&E as a CPE is concerned that contractual remedies are unlikely to result in quick or clear reimbursement for any non-performance. It also appears that just based on others' presentations during today, they'll highlight that an LSC may also find the benefits of self-showing unattractive due to some of these performance requirements, and that could have resulted or may have impacted some of the participation issue. So what PG&E is proposing is a binding mechanism, kind of like a binding notice of intent. Coupled with that is a CPE/CAM crediting approach, and this is somewhat of a multi-step process. So step 1, no later than May 31st of each calendar year, LSCs will choose or may choose to self-show their resources to the CPE. And again, this would be through a binding notice of intent, so eliminating the contractual agreement. Step 2, no later than September 15th, the CPE will file its RE plan to the Commission. The submission to the Commission would include everything that's all self-shown resources and all procured resources. The Commission would use that plan and give LSCs a CPE/CAM credit that would be used towards their RE obligation. So I'll note that the CPE decision had adopted a requirement for LSCs to submit a filing to the CAISO and Commission in late September of their self-shown resources, and we're suggesting to remove that requirement if this proposal is adopted. And I think given the proposal earlier by Energy Division, we'll evaluate sort of what the impact might be if we move this up from September 15th to July, late July or mid-July. Step 3 on October 31st, similar to when all of the RE plans are due, the CPE would submit its RE plan now just to the CAISO. Self-showing LSCs and suppliers would submit their self-shown resources on their CAISO plan. So no requirement to submit an RE plan again on self-shown resources. The CAISO supply plan would highlight the CPE as the benefiting. Next slide. And then step 4, so after the October 31st filing, the CPE would inform the commission if any self-shown resources did not perform to their commitment, and the CPE would adjust or decrease any of the CPE camp credits due to non-performance. So LSCs may need to take additional measures to meet their RA obligations, again, because the credits were being used towards their applicable system or flex obligations. And if they are not, or sort of not performing or not showing their resources, then those credits would be revised. And then lastly, if any local CPM does occur, then the commission would inform ISO of which LSCs will receive any associated CPM costs due to non-performance. I'll stop there. I think this, very high-level summary. I want to get into sort of the last topic item. Go to the next slide.
So Rhett, there's a question from Greg that he wants to know for the shown resources who would be responsible for meeting the CAISO resource substitution requirements.
That I think we would still want to maintain so we're not proposing any changes to the CAISO rules. So if the supplier is showing it on the supply plan, that obligation would stay with the scheduling coordinator.
Okay. Are we seeing any additional questions?
I was going to wait for Rhett to finish.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, this is the last slide. Oh yeah. The last kind of topic, as far as within PG&E slides, is not necessarily a proposal, but more of a discussion topic with parties. And so kind of PG&E is evaluating the functional use of this local effectiveness factors that are published in the CAISO's local capacity study. So we're evaluating the functional use of it as a criterion. And so what we're experiencing, or at least what the CPE has found in this first year, is that the local effectiveness factors, or LEF, for purposes of today, are dynamic and based on a set of assumptions that may not necessarily apply year over year. In addition, there can be multiple LEFs for multiple contingencies. And the second item is that some local resources do not have a published LEF, nor will new resources have a published LEF. So new resources or resources without one could be disadvantaged if this criterion is continuing to be used. And then there are also other selection criteria that are more useful in evaluating the overall local portfolio. So these include kind of the operational characteristics of the resource, including any future needs in local and sublocal areas, then any energy use limitations. So I think these other items, which are part of the CPE decision, have been proving to be more useful. So no proposal, but just the team is kind of evaluating its use.
Let's go to Bridget Sparks first.
Thanks. So this is Bridget from the CAISO. Can we go to slide 20? Okay. So a couple kind of questions and feedback on this is that if you want the CAISO to be the sort of enforcement mechanism, then your steps are a little misaligned because the way that CPM works is we can only cost allocate to the entities that carry the responsibility. And so we can't do after the fact, after the showing comes in, reallocation of costs in a different allocation methodology than what the entity's obligations were up front. And so I think, you know, one way to potentially accommodate this is if you kind of move step 5 in advance of step 3. So because the CPUC, you know, will know in ahead of time what entities have already agreed to self-show the resource, and that CPUC already has the ability to do the local RA obligations for its jurisdictional LSCs and report those to the CAISO in advance of that October 31 deadline. And so it seems like in between steps 2 and 3, if you want the CAISO to be the backstop enforcement mechanism of the self-shown resources, you would need to have the CPUC reallocate the local obligation to that entity that's agreeing to self-show. And then that will get reported to the CAISO. And then in our systems, we would be able to pick up and track what entities were responsible for showing which resources. And if they failed to show that to us, then our systems, and we had to backstop, then our systems would automatically cost allocate to those resources. But we can't do some after the fact reallocation on our end. And so that's just sort of the feedback on this mechanism. You know, we agree that the self-shown resources is a little messy right now. And so, you know, we would definitely be supportive of some further clarifications, but as written, this proposal wouldn't be implementable at the CAISO. But I think by modifying and having the commission reassign the obligations, you know, after the CPE does their solicitations and showings process, and has, you know, certainty over which entities are agreeing to self-show, then, you know, in advance of that October deadline, the CPUC could then reallocate out the local requirements to those entities that have said they want our self-show resources. So it's just feedback. Another question is if you could just kind of talk a little bit more about the CAM reduction methodology and how that would work. I'm a little confused about like how the commission would take back CAM credits and like what material consequence that would have on entities that fail to self-show.
Thanks, Bridget, for the first item. So I think we'll take that back and evaluate. So on the I guess it's step 4, 5. Yeah, on the CAM credit. So right now what we're thinking sort of at a high level is that the CAM credits at the moment only include what is procured by the CPE. So our thinking is that that would now include what is self-shown, but given sort of the full amount. And so if the resource does not perform or show up on a subsequent plan to the CAISO, then the commission would adjust those credits, likely decrease it, so the entity would no longer be able to apply it towards their system obligation. So they would essentially have to make that self-shown amount that was expected to be there with another resource to ensure they meet the RA obligation.
Okay, thank you.
Let's go to Mary Lynch.
Yeah, just very quickly back on slide 19. In number 2, the first bullet is CPM. Is that supposed to be CPE?
That is CPM, CAISO's CPM.
Okay, so then explain to me what this, you want a contractual agreement with whom?
No, so right now, any self-shown resources the CPE is required to execute a contractual agreement to ensure performance of that self-shown resource.
Oh, okay. All right. I was just misreading the statement. I get it. Thank you.
Okay, Noah?
Hi, this is Noah from Middle River. Just following up on what Bridget sort of was talking about. Can you let me know if I'm hearing it correctly? Essentially, instead of potentially doing the CAM credits, that the Energy Division would provide self-shown LSCs a specific local obligation, which would then sort of ensure essentially that such LSCs perform and show those resources in the supply plan and in the RA plan validations. CI seems to be in sort of more of a easier way than CAM credits and debits.
Sorry, no, was that a question to me?
It's the question to sort of the broad audience. We're in a workshop, so there's a conversation going on.
Oh. It sounded like that was option in that case that was suggesting.
Is that too far away from, and maybe this is also for the Energy Division, is this too far away from the hybrid framework itself to assign obligations to LSCs that are, that have self-shown?
I'll try to answer that. I don't think you're asking, is it an acceptable way to handle the procurement and a show, or the self-shown risk by assigning the local responsibility back to the entity that self-show, and would that kind of violate the hybrid framework? I think we're open, to all kind of, in my mind, I'll speak for the commission, but in my mind, I think we're open to all kind of potential modifications that are needed to, ensure that the framework can work and function. And so if assigning risk through assigning the local requirements to the shown LSE is, the best way to make sure the resource shows up, and, that's what parties believe it should be done, then I think we, it seems to be a potential option that could work. I'm not going to opine on whether I think it violates the hybrid framework. But I think we'd have to definitely modify what we did adopt in the decision, the initial decision, which does clearly allocate the entire requirement to the CPE.
Okay, great, thanks.
Greg, do you have another question?
Oh.
Okay, put your hand down, please. So we know if you have another question. All right, we'll go to Matt Barmack then.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
So Rhett, this is sort of a question about slide 23 as well as your fourth proposal. But it's really unclear to me, and maybe you can't go into this, how you are using operating characteristics to assemble a local RA portfolio. I'm not sure what operating characteristics other than maybe energy limits would actually should actually matter. So I'm just wondering if you could shed any light on that topic. And so relatedly, if we implement your fourth proposal and you're getting less information on operating characteristics for shown resources, do you view that as a problem?
Sorry, can you kind of restate the, I guess, the second question?
The first part of the question, or let me, okay, I think I can ask the whole thing probably more crisply, but slide 23, you talk about operating characteristics that are in the last bullet. You talk about operating characteristics that may be more useful in assembling a portfolio of local RA, more useful than effectiveness factors. And I'm just wondering what operating characteristics you have in mind, because to me it other than potentially energy limits, it's not really clear, you know, why you need operating characteristics or why they would be useful. But if they are useful, then under your fourth proposal, you're no longer going to be getting operating characteristic information on shown resources. And apparently you're okay with that. But I'm just asking whether that is okay or whether that's a potential problem.
Okay, I think I understand. So I guess fourth proposal in general, we're not necessarily suggesting to get rid of the information that the CP is requesting at this time. I recognize that that was kind of another driver on the amount of information requested. So I don't think we've sort of landed on eliminating all of the items at the moment. I think we are evaluating it. Operating characteristics in general, though, that's another item, and I apologize I can't get into, but kind of looking at what the criteria is in the decision, I personally think energy use limits is also a valuable item. So in general, I think math is we are kind of figuring out what information may or may not be needed in the overall evaluation.
Okay, thanks for that clarification.
Do you see any more questions, Simone?
I don't see any more questions, so why don't we move on to SCE?
SCE, are you on?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Wen Liao, and I'm a senior advisor in the Power Origination Group within SCE, and I'll be presenting our proposal today for the CPE implementation. In looking at our agenda, we largely have two items that we wanted to discuss. First is our proposal on changes in the self-showing process. And then secondly, our proposal on the levelized fixed cost for IOUs. We do have a few other priorities, which we consider less urgent than those two. So we'll spend most of our time discussing the two proposals. Next slide, please. Okay, perfect. So on this slide, we outline the process that we would like to see updated for the self-showing process. So before I get into it, I think, this is really predicated on the fact that, we view the self-showing process as very crucial to the CPE process overall, because it allows CPE to get resources mostly for no compensation, and therefore reduces the procurement cost for all customers across the board. And secondly, our proposal here, again, is working under the assumption that LSCs generally don't want to take back their local obligation, as it implicates them into, having to show up for substitutes and replacements. So we're trying to find a way to incentivize participation, but also at the same time, make sure that the obligations are being met. So on a high level, we're suggesting that the self-showing be completed ahead of the CP solicitation to include all available local area resources already under contract with LSCs. Any CAISO backstop costs associated with non-performance due to outages of self-shown resources will be socialized among all LSCs. And so the process we're envisioning will start with an LSC If that LSC is deciding not to bid a specific local resource into the CPE solicitation, then it will self-show that resource with CPE by letting the CPUC and CPE know prior to the launch of the CPE solicitation, by submitting an attestation along with the listing of the resources that they're going to be showing to the CPE for the 3-year local obligation. If an LSC chooses not to self-show a local resource to the CPE, but later shows it in its system year-ahead plan, then the LSC will need to file a justification with the CPUC as to why they decided not to self-show that resource along with their year-ahead plan. We think this is important so that the commission can understand, and also the CPE can understand, why certain local resources were not either being bid into or self-shown to the CPE solicitation, and therefore, we can make adjustments to the process if needed. Next, there will be no contracts between CPE and LLCs for self-shown resources. These resources will be credited towards CPE's procurement target, meaning that, when we get our gross target, we will remove self-shown resources and along with CAM and other resources to get to a net procurement target that we're working towards for the next 3 years. For commitments, so self-shown commitments made for year 1 resources, we're asking that to be firm. Meaning that, for example, next year in 22, we'll be soliciting for 23, 24, and 25. So any sort of self-shown resources made for 23, those will be firm. But later, for years 2 and 3, we want to give the flexibility in that LSCs may replace certain shown local resources with other resources, as long as the megawatts don't change. Next, we wanted to provide LSCs with an additional opportunity to let us know if they have procured any additional local resources. So sometime, here we propose August, which is in the middle of our solicitation, LSCs can have a second opportunity to essentially self-show to the CPE. Okay, next slide, please. Similarly to now, LSCs who self-show will be required to file their showing with the CPUC on September 30th. And here is where, our proposal is different, that we're saying, if there are any deficiencies in the month ahead process due to generator outages, and I mean planned outages, and if there are any CAISO backstop associated with those self-shown resources, then the costs will be socialized among all LSC customers in the CPE's TAC area. LSCs who self-show will be required to provide CPE with a notice of any such outages within 60 days of the showing month in which the outage will occur. So here, I think what we're trying to get at is that we understand that all generators need to take outages in order to maintain their facilities. And sometimes it can be difficult for LSCs to, find replacement in a specific local area, due to those outages. However, we also understand that outages, they don't happen during the summer months. And sometimes, even if they don't show up, the CAISO backstop may not be necessary. So here, we're just saying, if we believe that having folks be more incentivized to self-show outweighs the potential cost of any CAISO backstop that may happen that's associated with such outages. Okay. And then next bullet, if, however, there are any deficiencies in the month ahead process due to non-performance that are not related to outages and there are CAISO backstop costs that's associated, then we're asking the CPUC to direct CAISO to charge the CPM cost to that specific LSC or its scheduling coordinator to pay such costs. I did hear Bridget's from CAISO's, discussion earlier with PG&E regarding, how to actually action this. So we understand this is not perfectly thought out, and we're happy to work with CPUC and CAISO to come up with a way that this can be operationalized. And lastly, in order to encourage additional showings, especially outside of an LSC specific TAC area, we're saying any LSCs outside the CPE's TAC area who self-shows a local resource to the CPE will not be subject to the requirements above, including being responsible for any costs in the event of a CAISO deficiency. So I will pause here for any questions.
I do see one question from Eric Little.
Yeah, Eric, did you want to?
Yeah, Wen, I just want to get clarity on your third main bullet point here. What is the scenario in which that would occur? Are you envisioning a situation in which simply they don't show the resource in that individual month, even though it's not on outage? Is that the scenario that you're depicting here?
Yeah, if for whatever reason they don't show it, or if there's something going on with their contract and they've perhaps had an issue with, you know, the generator, then in that case they're on the hook for any sort of CAISO backstop cost.
Okay, so can I just one more detail here to make sure I understand. What happens if there's a dispute between the LSE and the generator? The LSE shows it on a showing, but the generator does not submit a supply plan for it.
That's a good question. I think that in that case, that's something that I would envision the LSE would need to work out, and then ultimately, you know, figure out who is going to be responsible for the CAISO backstop cost.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to make sure I understood it. Thank you.
I think there's one more question from
Yes,
Noah.
let's go to Noah.
Hey, this is Noah from Middle River Power. Can you clarify how the self-shown process and the outage planning process are related here?
Yeah. So what we're saying here is that, you know, let's give an example. Let's say LSEA shows the CPE and says, hey, we're going to show resource A for all 12 months of 2023. But, you know, any resource generally has to take planned outages to maintain their facility. So for example, let's say, but however, generally they don't tell you when the planned outages occur, at least not that far in advance. So let's say then the generator tells LSEA, hey, we're going to have to take an outage for 20 days in February. And then as long as that LSE tells the CPE within 60 days of the showing months of February, then we're saying, okay, then you don't have to put it on your RA plan, and that the generator doesn't have to put it on their supply plan. However, in that case, likely, you know, there's going to be there will be a deficiency when CAISO says, hey, you know, CPE owes us, you know, this whole megawatts, but this generator didn't show up, so they're short. And then if CAISO at that point decides this is a problem and we have to go to backstop, then the cost of that backstop will be socialized among everybody in the CPE's TAC area.
And are you saying that this or the risk of having to show and commit resources on a full year basis is prohibiting LSEs, or I guess LSEs, yeah, from self-showing into the process?
Yeah, we want to avoid that risk. And we want to encourage as much self-showing as possible.
Okay, thanks.
Bridget, you're next.
Yeah, I had a question about this last bullet, and just a little worried if it could create some unintended consequences. So, for an LLC that has a local resource outside of their respective TAC areas, but then shows it to that CPE in that TAC area, but then fails to follow up on that obligation. I kind of get the point if it was due to outages, but the other instance where maybe they just decide not to show it for any reasons besides outages, it seems to me it's a little problematic to then socialize those costs to that TAC area. And if it would make more sense to, if we like move forward with the kind of proposal that if the CAISO is the one directly assigning the backstop costs to the LLC that fails to self-show. Seems like that should happen regardless of what TAC area they're in, if they're, agreeing to show this resource. So I'm wondering if, what your thought process was behind that last bullet, and if you'd be open to maybe modifying it for the instances other than outages where that LLC would still carry sort of that backstop risk, even if they're not in that TAC area.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Bridget. And we did think about this quite a bit because right now, the way we understand it is very little incentive for LSCs outside of CPE's TAC area to self-show anything in that TAC area, because it's not like they're getting a share of the cost reduction, and they're then taking on, like additional risk to them. So that's why we came up with this, to try to, again, encourage as much self-showing. But we do see your point in that, outages is one thing, but if they just decided, hey, I'm just not going to do this for whatever reason, then that could be problematic, especially if they self-showed, a large number of megawatts. So, I mean, I can't speak for the rest of the team, but I think that's something, we would consider, and we can certainly, talk about that more in our reply comments to the workshop.
All the questions when, if you want to move on.
Okay, perfect. So next page. Here we just basically on a very high level summarize kind of the changes between the existing structure and our proposed structure. So the first one, committing shown resources. Currently there's a contract between the LSE and the CPE. In our proposed structure, we're saying let's not do a contract, let's do an attestation instead. And also additional resources can be shown like one more time, let's say around August 1st, for any additional local resources. And the next one is RA filing. Currently, both the CPE and an LSCs who self-show must file on September 30th. There's no change to that. So the only thing is we're saying if LSCs, if they don't show to the CPE and they don't bid it into their solicitation, but then local resources show up in their year-ahead supply plan or RA plan, then they need to file a justification to the CPUC as to why they did not participate in the CPE's solicitation. Performance monitoring, it's still currently being done by the CPE under both scenarios. And then the CPM cost allocation. So currently, LSCs are required to perform per the terms of their contract and may be subject to CPM costs. But as we talked about in our new proposal, all CPM costs related to non-performance due to outages will be paid by all customers. And then the self-showing LSC will be responsible for any CPM costs associated with non-performance that's not related to outages. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so that summarizes our proposal on the changes to the self-show process. And so now I'm going to move on to our proposal on the updated levelized fixed cost. On a high level, we're proposing to eliminate the requirement for IOUs to only bid in at their levelized fixed cost into its own CPE solicitation. And the reason why we feel this should be done is that currently this requirement puts the IOUs at a disadvantage by not allowing them to bid into the solicitation at market prices like any other LSC. And by allowing the distribution utilities to bid into their CPE solicitation similar to any other LSCs will allow them to bid their local resources at market prices, which will result in lower costs for all customers and also allow them to better monetize power charge and difference adjustment PCIA resources and reduce rates for bundle service customers and customers subject to the PCIA. So what we're saying right now, what we're seeing is that because the IOUs have to bid at the levelized fixed cost, it's potentially bidding in a higher cost than it would otherwise offer if it was allowed to. And that's really not benefiting all customers, because if they were to bid in at lower prices, then everybody could potentially benefit from the lower cost. Okay, next slide, please. So our understanding of why this stipulation was put in place is that is to really to reduce or eliminate any sort of potential unfair competitive advantages that the IOU may have. However, we think it's already being mitigated because one, the IOUs must submit their bids ahead of all other market participants. So they really can't use any other bids to inform their pricing. Two, the CPE has competitive neutrality rules and a strict code of conduct that governs the conduct of all personnel with access to CPE confidential information. And we have separation of duties as well as restriction of sharing of information. In addition, we have put up firewalls in all of our systems to restrict access to any CPE confidential information to anybody on the utility bid team. And lastly, the independent evaluator monitors all aspects of the solicitation process. So we really do think that given the many layers of protection to ensure that CPE confidential information is not shared, that this risk has already been mitigated. Next slide. So here are some of our lower priority positions. We'd like to reserve our advocacy for these following items later through the OIR. However, here just to highlight quickly, we want to talk about clarity on PCIA contracts and how CPE pays for it. Two is potentially allowing CPE to procure through broker markets. And three is to allow CPE to procure outside of the annual CPE solicitation for targeted areas using targeted resources for specific purposes outside meeting local RA obligation. So we won't go into it further here, but wanted to highlight that as a future reference. Yes, Eric.
So when just a question on the mitigation that you say is there right now, how does that address the fact that if I look at the Edison filing, the bulk majority of what was used for the meeting of local areas was self-shown by SCE? So, and you only bought one single resource. Knowing that set of information seems to tell you a lot about the competitiveness of the local area and would give you a lot of information in bidding those resources.
I see what you're saying. Let me think on that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Can I get back to you on Eric? Because I don't know if I have a great answer right off the bat.
Yeah, and Eric, this is Maria. If I can just maybe ask you to just repeat it again, I apologize.
Sure, Maria. So you've got these list of mitigating factors of not having to bid your own resources at their levelized fixed cost. And basically, it sounds like the implication is the IOU would be free to bid them at any level that they please. But if I look at the results that you had filed in the last solicitation, the bulk majority of megawatts came from shown SCE resources, is my recollection. There were some very large resources in there, in fact. So knowing that set of information, doesn't that naturally give you a competitive advantage, knowing historically what your position has been compared to others and what that's going to mean for solicitation prospects?
I mean, I think, historically, RA prices have changed quite a bit year after year. And I think SCE did self-show quite a bit, and what we're trying to fix rules really kind of for the future, not necessarily for the next round of solicitations. And, as you know, these contracts will drop off here in the next few years, and SCE may not be in the same position it is today to be able to self-show all those resources. Secondly, SCE could still bid it in with a backup bid to self-show if it was not selected, as you know, so you kind of go through that whole iterative process, and we're not proposing that change. So I think there are a few factors that maybe led to the self-showing, but still, in the spirit of the decision where all LSCs should be treated equally, I think that's why we're proposing that SCE also be able to bid in like anyone else, and just highlighted that if concern was any of the sensitive information around pricing that we believe that would not be an issue moving forward.
Okay, thank you.
Matt Barmack?
Yes.
Hey, I had a question about the showing proposal and I guess maybe specifically about slide 29, but just more generally, how would your proposal treat local resources that have been procured as system RA and not as local RA? So, you know, an LSE that's procured a local resources system may, you know, contractually, it may not be able to show that resource is local to either the CPE or the ISO. And so would it then have to attest that it procured this resource as system RA and contractually was not able to show it as local RA? And just more generally, I'm having a hard time thinking through how contracts like that might be addressed by your proposal.
Yeah. So my understanding of RA is that you can't separate out local versus system attributes. Like when somebody purchases 100 megawatts of RA from generator A, and that generator A, let's say, happens to be in LA Basin, then the person or the LSE who purchased it would have the attributes, whether local or system, for that resource. And so we believe that then if, I understand that the LSE currently only has a system obligation, so it's only purchasing, you know, to meet their own system obligation, but we would expect that that LSE would be able to show to the CPE, you know, the local, like that same resource for the local obligation that the CPE has.
Yeah, I think we have a different understanding. I agree that with the first part of what you said, that the attributes are bundled. But we think the contracts for a local resource procured as local RA and a local resource procured as system RA, those contracts are different and entail different obligations. And it sort of goes to the substitution and replacement obligations that you're you know, that you're trying to make those easier for shown resources. But I think there is a contractual issue here, and we don't think that local resources procured as system RA necessarily can be shown by the buyers as local RA.
Okay, I think that's where perhaps we're having a difference in the understanding. So I would certainly appreciate maybe some clarity, maybe written clarity as to, you know, how exactly that works, so that we can make, you know, if that's truly the case, then we could make, you know, that would be an appropriate justification for why you can't show it to us. But as of right now, our baseline understanding is that when one purchases RA, it comes with both system and local, and that LSE should be able to show for both.
Okay, yeah, we can try to clarify that, or we'd be happy to have a conversation about that with you as well.
Let's go to Matt Burke.
Yeah, hi, this is Matt Burke at PG&E. Just a brief clarifying question, and it's on this slide, actually, on 29. So I understand from what it says here that if a LSE doesn't show to the CPE, but then shows it on their year-ahead supply plan for system, they would have to provide a justification statement. Can you give some thought around, you know, what would be a justified scenario not to show to the CPE, but then to show on the year-ahead supply plan and the reverse? And then also, I guess, secondly, if it was deemed that, you know, the behavior was not justified, you know, what would be the following action or penalty, or if there would be any?
Yeah, So that's a good question. I think the one that comes to mind as an example is, let's say if you don't self-show because you decided to bid in and you bid in, but we didn't pick it up, and then you show for your system, then that's to us a justified action. And another potential one is perhaps, and again, this is us thinking out loud, is perhaps in the later years, let's say, next year we're going out for 25 and you have some resources, but, in your resource planning, you feel that maybe you're too long in 25 and that you might want to sell some of those system resources, so that you're not, you don't have too much RA in your portfolio, then I believe that could be a justified reason for why you're not showing it to the CPE. Currently, we're not anticipating any sort of, penalty or something for not self-showing. I think right now we're thinking this is more of an information gathering phase. And down the road, if we find that there's many LSCs who are just for whatever reason not participating in the CPE, and we have, these justifications coming in, then I think that's when perhaps we'll have another workshop and, everybody, including Energy Division, would need to decide what to do about that going forward.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Yep.
Don't see any other questions.
Okay, so at this point, I want to propose, if there are no additional comments or questions, that we take a 5-minute pause or 4 minutes. We'll resume at 3:20 with Eric Little, I believe, and then followed by Calpine, and then we can close with RM, and then we have another 15 minutes worth of questions, so we can a session where we can address additional questions. So let's take a break, and we will see you back at 3:20. Hi, everyone. I'm not able to hear anyone, but if you can let me know if you can hear me, that would be great. If you can type something in the chat box. Great. Okay, thank you. Is Eric on? Eric Little from CalCCA.
Yeah, I'm on. You can't hear me, of course, so I don't know that that's doing any good to tell you that I'm on.
Actually, Eric, I can hear you now, so thank you.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, great.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm ready to go anytime you are.
Perfect. Okay. So let's get started here.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eric Little from CalCCA. I think you're going to see a bit different perspective here in the afternoon, the later afternoon. The first two presentations were from CPEs who were actually involved in the solicitations and have an idea as to what happened. I think this later afternoon, you're going to see from entities that saw the results and are left to wonder what happened. I think as a kind of main message here, there's a lot to know about what went wrong. I think that Greg talked about this a bit in some of his questions, and I know that some of the questions I'm going to have here seem like, you know, the effort to finger point. They're not. When a solicitation doesn't work or a process doesn't work the way that you thought that it did, you really need to understand the details of what happened, whom it happened with, and what the incentives of those entities were. Because that makes a big difference in whether or not this is going to be successful. So I think that's a lot of what you're going to hear in this at least in this presentation. So as I mentioned, the first bullet point here, we really don't have a lot of information. We do have from Edison a bit more information on what they did pick up, but we are lacking a lot of information from both solicitations to really know what happened. What we do know from PG&E's amendment that they filed is that there was a significant shortfall, upwards of 50%, as Greg mentioned, between 4 gigawatts and over 6 gigawatts. And so we do believe that there needs to be an expeditious process to go out and meet that procurement. And I'll talk a bit later about why that needs to be expedited. Then I think when we start looking again, when you start trying to figure out why this went wrong, I think the incentives are very, very important. And we need to understand what incentives there are and what disincentives there are for entities self-showing. And I do think that there are examples of both of those that we need to talk through. And then finally, there is a clarification on some information about PCIA benchmark and what happens with that when resources are self-shown by the IOU as the CPE. So I'll get to that on that slide as well. So if we can move on to the next page, please. All right, so again, we had advice letters and we saw some information out of them, but we really didn't see a lot. Edison did provide some information on what they actually procured through either bids or self-showings. And so there is a lot of information where you can take a look at the specific resources, who self-showed them for what period of time. PG&E didn't provide that information. We simply know the total of what they procured versus their total procurement obligation and what the deficiency is. I think we do know some information about allocated resources, but otherwise don't know what the CPE itself actually picked up. More importantly, we don't know a lot of other information that would be important to figure out where the incentives were. For example, was there capacity offered but was rejected, and what were the reasons for those rejections, both for self-shown and those that were offered for purchase? And that was discussed a little bit earlier on. And while I did hear PG&E to say they simply did not receive enough self-showings or enough bids to be able to make their requirement, it's not clear to me whether or not there was also a set in there that even with that known that there was other things that got rejected. Were there any capacity offers that were withdrawn, and what was the reason for them for being withdrawn? Was there capacity within a local area that was not offered to the CPE? It sounded like the answer to that is yes, but it would be good then to know what is the controlling entity of those resources that were not offered. And again, this is not a finger pointing exercise to say somebody didn't do something. This is an exercise to say, okay, if there were resources that weren't offered, either weren't self-shown or weren't offered to sell to the CPE, then you have to start asking questions about the incentives and why that happened. Because if we ignore those, then any future solicitation is likely to run into the same exact problem. So I'll pause there for a moment and see if there's any questions on this first slide. I'm going to assume that there are no questions. Either that or you can't hear me and I'm talking to myself, one or the other. All right, seeing that the page flipped over, I'm going to assume there were no questions. I'll keep moving on. So as we discussed, the PG&E shortfall, we've got upwards of over 6,000 megawatts, or about 50% of the requirement. That was for like the entire last quarter. There's not real clarity right now on what, if any, additional procurement is going to be done, nor what the CAISO backstop options really are. What we do know about the ISO's backstop options is they don't have the ability to go out and backstop this now. They won't have the ability to backstop the 2023 procurement until the 2022 showing is done. And at that point in time, it's pretty late to be able to do much. And I also question, depending upon why the CPE was unable to meet these, whether or not the ISO will be able to backstop anything as well. So, for example, if it's because these resources are owned by load-serving entities and load-serving entities weren't willing to self-provide them, their only option at the ISO is to sell it in a CPM, which means that they're going to sell not only the local, but they're going to sell the system and the flex as well. And of course, if they do that, they're going to run into quite potentially a problem with their own requirements for system and for flex. So it's not clear, one, what the CPE's process is to try to take care of that position between now and 2023. And it's not clear what the ISO can or could do to take care of that problem as well. The next step of this then is the problems that LSEs face in looking at this. The unfulfilled position of an LSE is based upon their load, the amount that they've already procured, and those things that are going to be allocated to them. And you've got to look at a 6,000 megawatt deficiency and say, so there's potentially 6,000 plus megawatts that are going to be allocated to all LSEs. And if I know my load ratio share, that may be a pretty significant amount that could get allocated to me. And so when I go out to do my own solicitation to meet my own system and flex needs, I have to keep that in mind. And it creates a real difficulty in doing procurement, because if I simply say I assume that they're not going to do anything with that, and I need to meet my obligations, I could end up well over procured between my own procurement and then any costs that are going to be allocated to me by the CPE. If on the other hand, I assume that they're going to fill that entire position and I'm going to get my load ratio share and they don't, I could be very well short and subject to some significant penalties. So there's a lot of difficulty here in dealing with this, and the LSEs are planning their own solicitations right now. They need to be able to anticipate those open positions, and they need to finalize those quantities. And right now, from what I saw earlier today, with these things kind of potentially ending as late as September, that's a long time to wait to find out what your final is on this before you actually complete your own solicitation. I don't think that that's practical for the LSEs. Based upon that, the next bullet point talks about it. We really do think that the CPE needs to complete their procurement and their allocations by the beginning of June, which is the typical time frame in which the Commission adopts the final quantities of RA. So that there is certainty on what their procurement obligations are going to be. And then if they're not able to do that, then there's a significant question about the appropriateness of penalties in those situations. And that's a really difficult thing. I know that this is the year ahead showing, so it's not the 1 time, 2 times, 3 times paradigm yet. But in the monthly showings, it does indeed get there. And so you could be talking about penalties between $8.88 a kilowatt month and something in the neighborhood of $27 a kilowatt month, which is pretty significant. So the potential for penalties associated with this for items that are so outside of the control of the LSEs is a really difficult one. So I do think that the Commission ought to be considering the waiver of system and flex penalties for the open positions that are because of these potential CAM or CAISO allocations that simply the LSEs don't have a meaningful way to forecast, unless that is done by June and we have complete information. So let me pause there and see if there's any questions on that.
I don't see any hands.
Okay, fantastic. Let's move on to the next page then. So again, I talked earlier about how we really need to understand the incentives at play and the disincentives that are at play. And what we do know from an incentive standpoint is they're pretty inadequate. The LCR RCM is very low. There's not any area that's higher than $1.78. And we also know that the LCR RCM is not available to thermal resources, and it's not available to resources that were procured pre-LCR RCM. So there's a significant amount of resources out there that we get paid zero, and a small number of resources that could get paid as at most $1.78. So the amount of revenues that are going to flow to an LSE for self-showing these is very, very small. Yes, I get it. They avoid the potential that the CPE is going to buy something and allocate those costs to them, but that's an uncertainty as well as to how much of that there will be. It's definitely not a one-for-one. There are also some disincentives. If you bid a resource that's an LSE or a generator, you're going to give up the system in the Flex RA. So bidding into the CPE solicitation means that you're not keeping any of the attributes of that resource. So bidding in, if it's going to make you short in terms of system and in terms of local, is probably a non-starter, which means that the best that you're going to do is the LCR RCM for self-showing. There were also some difficulties, and this is, I will tell you, this is my read through of the pro formas. So if there's anybody who has written those pro formas who sees it differently, I would encourage you to raise your hand and chime in here. But the way that I read the pro formas, it appears that PG&E does not allow for substitution of a resource. So if I am self-showing a resource, I have to self-show that exact resource. So even if I have a contract that says that I can get another resource to substitute for that and take care of the problem of that resource being on outage, the PG&E pro forma does not allow me to do that. The PG&E pro forma also seems to have termination provisions and indemnification provisions that indicate to me that if PG&E were to get a CPM backstop because that resource, they didn't have anything to substitute it, they will pass those costs through to the self-provider. It also appears that they can terminate the contract even if it failed to perform in 1 month. So I'm taking a pretty significant risk self-showing this, that I may be getting a cost for substitution at potentially $6.31 per kilowatt month from that would come through the ISO on a CPM basis for receiving no more than $1.78. And then I do note that the SCE pro forma does seem to allow substitution, but it also still seems to have the pass-through of damages if a resource fails. So I think that basically, and I think this is true of PG&E's as well, if the CPE goes out and procures something, so just suppose the CPE is able to go out and get it at $4 per kilowatt month, well, then they won't charge you $6.31, they'll charge you the $4, but nonetheless, you'll be charged. So there's a significant disincentive here to showing these resources. There's not a lot of incentive that offsets that on the other side. So let me pause there and see if there's any questions or if there's anyone who wants to clarify any of the pro forma language, if I'm misunderstanding any of it. Okay, not hearing any, we can move on to the next page. So this next page gets into the clarification that we were looking for on how PCIA benchmarks work. And I think it may just be that the language perhaps got it backwards. So if an IOU's resource is bid and selected into the CPM, those costs would normally be a PCIA cost.
Sorry. We did actually get a few people who wanted to respond. Do you want to let them respond now? Or?
Yeah, let's go back to slide 38.
All right. All right. Let's go to Mark. You're unmuted.
Yeah, this is Mark Marnishi with PG&E. Eric, I appreciate the comments. I just wanted to ask one clarification question. I know you mentioned, some pieces about PG&E's pro forma contract and allowing or not allowing substitution. I just want to clarify what you meant by substitution. Does that apply to the substitution that's allowed under the CAISO tariff rules after the RH filings are made, or is that replacement of resources under the agreement in
Yeah,
advance of
sorry.
that, but
I despise the terms replacement and substitution because I confuse them all the time. What I'm really talking about here is that this is a potentially up to a 3-year deal. And so 2-3 years out, I don't know exactly what the outage schedule is going to be. And if I get a couple of months ahead and realize that the resource is going to be on outage, I want to be able to provide an alternative resource to that. And that is what I view the pro forma from PG&E as not allowing to happen. So it's not within the ISO's market when it comes to avoidance of the RA aim costs. This is really before a showing is made.
got it. Okay, no, that's helpful, Eric. No, I appreciate that context. Want to be sure we understood your comment there. Thank you.
And I apologize if I'm using the terms incorrectly, but that's what I'm referring to. Was there another question, Simone?
There's Maria Litos. Do you have a question, Maria? No. I guess not.
Okay, sorry, am I off mute now? So I was talking and I guess I was still on mute. So we don't disagree with those concerns, Eric, SCE, and that's why we proposed our self-showing concept. But just also wanted to point out that, you know, you are referring to the pro forma, and SCE did have sympathy for the, you know, so-called replacement and did accommodate some contract changes in those negotiations. Unfortunately, those contract negotiations are confidential, so it doesn't really help you, but we did kind of understand that and tried to, you know, meet people halfway, if you will.
Yeah, and thank you, Maria. And unfortunately, the only thing I have to go on here is because I can't discuss any confidential information and understand that. And that was part of the first part of this, which is we don't know really what happened, and some of that because of confidentiality concerns. I do appreciate the information from you on this. It's very, very helpful. I think that we need, like I say, I think we need a lot more information to really be able to understand. But as well, since Edison offered, PG&E, do you have any comment on this? Not that you have to, but is there anything you'd like to say about pro forma and what you did in contract negotiations, if you're able to say so without breaching confidentiality?
Yeah, Eric, this is Marty Sue, PG&E. You know, I think at this point, I don't think there's anything we can say without breaching some of the confidentiality protections and provisions we have in our solicitation and our agreement. So unfortunately, there's nothing really to share right now.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Okay, appreciate that input. Most definitely do. Were there any other questions on this?
That's it for now.
Okay.
Eric, I have one question. This is Jamie from Energy Division. So on a prior slide, you had, you know, mentioned or brought up that you'd like the procurement to be locked down by June. And I wanted to get your thoughts on, I guess, because we are, you know, because of our current timeline in the RA space, we don't adopt the local requirements until for the coming year and you know, for the next 3 years until the end of June. So I guess, how do you see that interacting with a June deadline for CPE procurement?
Yeah, so I think it's a magnitude issue, Jamie. So I know that when we were developing CPE, the idea that I recall that was bantered around was that because we're going to have a 150% requirement for the 3-year period, that you as an LSE would have a lot of certainty 2 years ahead. And that the only thing that would realistically change is your load ratio share would change, and perhaps the local requirement changes, but very likely by a small quantity, because to that point in time, it had only changed by small quantities. The PG&E change of 2,000 megawatts in their local area, and I'm not blaming that on PG&E, it was in their local area. I don't think it happened at the point in time that we were describing this. So the general beliefs were that the local area requirements were going to change no more than a couple of hundred megawatts, and that LSEs would know their load ratio share changes because they would have seen that load moving about. So when you're dealing with that, it's not quite as big of a deal to have uncertainty on that information because it's a handful of megawatts that you're dealing with, and you can reasonably address that within procurement and taking on those risks as you do things. The problem here is that it's not a handful of megawatts, it's 6,000 megawatts plus. And so having that information hanging out there all the way through that period of time makes it extraordinarily difficult for LSEs to know what their share of that is going to be. If any of it gets picked up, if any of it gets allocated, if none of it gets picked up, none of it gets allocated, it's just a gigantic volume for them to be able to try to address in that process. Okay, any other questions on that? Okay, so I'll try to go back to PCIA here. So when the CPE does its solicitation and it picks up an IOU resource, they're supposed to move the PCIA balances to CAM. And that, generally seems okay for the period of time that the resource is a CPE resource, it stays in CAM. But then we have the decision 2006-002 that says that shown resources are still subject to the local PCIA benchmarks adopted in 1910-001, which provide an RA capacity offset to the PCIA charge. I think, though, that in this case, it's not the local capacity that needs to be credited back, it's the system, because effectively what's happening is for those resources, the price is really the system benchmark and not the local benchmark. And that is in particular for self-shown resources by the IOU, because they're retaining the ability to use the system attributes for themselves. And so it's really that which needs to be credited back to PCIA because that's what's being picked up. Hopefully that makes sense. I know this is a kind of a confusing issue, but I'm not sure if just in this decision that the language in here just got reversed, or if it wasn't really considering what a self-shown resource really meant for this purpose. So let me open it up to see if there's any questions on this.
Go to Rhett.
Oh, thanks. Hey, Eric, just thanks. More clarifying question. And so on this particular issue, is this an item that I guess Cal CCA is looking to address in the March decision, or kind of are you looking more towards it being addressed in the PCIA proceeding or docket?
Thank you, Rhett. I think it needs to be addressed here because this really isn't a PCIA issue in and of itself. It's really how the RA program is applying PCIA information to its own process. So these decisions, I think, came out of RA and so are appropriately addressed here. So, and that's also important because this decision comes out before the ERA filings happen. So we get clarity on it before we get into ERA.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions on this one? Okay, I think we can move to my last slide then. So this one really becomes a question of whether or not this central procurement entity framework is actually going to work. And again, I go back to what I discussed earlier, which was this CPA was really designed in an environment where local was significantly constrained and local went for a premium over system. We have since that point in time seen system become very much constrained, and we're now seeing that there's 9 local areas, 3 of which have no premium, 3 of which have a premium between $0 and $1, and 3 of them that have a premium of greater than $1 but less than $2. It's not very much of a premium. And so you end up in a situation where when I am trying to fulfill a system or a flex obligation I quite simply want the least expensive resource that I have available to me for that need. If that happens to be a resource in the local area, so be it, I'm going to pick it up. And that's what's going to happen in solicitation process. At the same time, you've got the opposite side of that, which is the seller, either a generator or marketer, who says, I want to receive the highest price I can for my resource. And so if the highest price is selling to somebody for a system obligation and not for a local obligation, that is where they're going to sell. There's been some pretty clear messages sent to LSEs that meeting compliance obligations is important. That's the 1 times, 2 times, 3 times penalty mechanism that I discussed earlier, with penalty prices exceeding $27 in some periods. And so there's very much an incentive to go and buy those system resources and make sure that you are not subject to that penalty. When you get those types of incentives moving together, there is very much a possibility that resources that are local are going to get picked up for system, not for local purposes. And then you combine that with the earlier discussion of the potential lack of incentive or disincentives for showing a resource in a local area, and you're going to have difficulty meeting these objectives. The other thing I'll note is when we look at history, the CPE did not clearly perform better in 2023 than individual LSEs did back in 2021. And while I don't know exactly how LSEs performed because there's not a lot of public information about meeting those RA requirements, what we do know is that the California ISO did not backstop local RA through CPM. We do know that there was a single RMR for Agnews, but that was for a local reliability, but not due to a deficiency in local RA showings. So it was an issue of if the resource were to retire, that they felt that they couldn't meet the local obligations within that area, and so wanted to backstop that resource. That was my recollection of the Agnews contract. So like I say, what we have seen is it doesn't appear that the ISO had to backstop an RA deficiency for an insufficient local on an LSE-based system in 2021. Yet here we are looking at 2023 with over 6,000 megawatt shortage, which I would be surprised if the ISO decided that they did not need to backstop that. I think that in this framework, it's really difficult to fix all of those incentive issues and make them work under every set of conditions. What we do know is when LSEs have an incentive to go out and buy something, that they will get that done. When they are faced with RA penalties for failing, when they are faced with utilizing their own procurement to meet their own obligations, that they will do so. And that they will find ways to not only meet those RA requirements, but also go out and meet state mandates for policy goals by building new resources in local areas that are renewable as well. So if we can try to get these, if we could try to get the incentives lined up behind those who need to procure, and that procurement being done, I think we stand a much better chance than if we just have the current mechanism where there's a lack of incentives and a lack of alignment between LSEs and the CPE. So let me stop there and see if there's any question on this slide or anything else that I've said previously. Okay, so the only thing that I will add is on that.
Do you have a question? Your hand is going up and down.
Oh.
You're unmuted, Maria.
Okay, sorry, I'm struggling here. Sorry. So Eric, unless I missed it, then maybe are you proposing to fix the CPE framework so it does incentivize, similar to some of the proposals you've heard from PG&E or us? Are you proposing potentially that the CPE framework just be dismantled and go back to the way it was before? Just want to get your thoughts and figure out exactly like.
Yeah, so Maria, I think we need to consider all of those options. Like I said earlier, the problem right now is we don't really know what caused this failure because of the lack of information out there. And so I don't know which incentives or disincentives or lack of incentives are causing this problem. What I do know is that when we had LSE-based incentives, the procurement obligations were largely met. Sure, there were some requests for waivers for local in 2021. There was a lot of confusion about the aggregation and disaggregation of the PG&E local area. It's largely been worked through at this point. I don't know what the magnitude of those were because those filings don't really tell you much about the quantities. They just tell you that somebody has requested a waiver. But like I say, that's why I have to kind of fall back on whether or not the ISO did significant backstop, and they didn't during that period of time, which would lead me to believe that while there were requests for waivers, that the quantities may not have been gigantic. So what I'm saying is that faced with not knowing what the disincentives were to have the CPE come in 6,000 megawatts short versus what the incentives were before that appear to have not produced those types of shortages, I think we need to consider whether or not it's time to go back to an LSE-based approach, along with trying to identify what other incentives and disincentives are there in this program right now.
Got it. Thank you.
Any other questions?
There's one from Teresa Pham.
Yeah, this is Teresa Pham from Southern California Edison. Eric, could you repeat again the arguments that you're making to use the system RA-MPB? I'm sorry, I had a hard time hearing that part.
I'm not sure that I did. I don't recall saying anything about system and NPV. Can you clarify?
Oh, you said use the system. Was it a return if the showing is not accepted, then the use of the system RA-MPB should be used as opposed to the local RA-MPB? Or maybe I just misheard that portion of your presentation. I think it was in your PCIA slide.
No, so the only thing that I was saying on PCIA is it's a question of the market price benchmark.
Yes,
And so which market price benchmark are they utilizing for this? And what they seem to be utilizing right now is the local value rather than the system value. And the more appropriate benchmark for this would be the system value, because that's what's being retained by the IOU for its own uses. So that should go through. That should be a credit back to PCIA rather than the opposite way around.
Okay, I see. So you're suggesting that the valuation should be on the system RA-MPB as opposed to the local RA-MPB for crediting the PABA.
Correct.
I see. And is it the situation that, because usually in terms of, valuing and sizing the local RA, it's to the extent that you don't use it for local RA purposes, then you can use that RA for system RA purposes. So I'm just trying to understand, is it the assumption then that whatever RA is there would actually be used for system RA purposes as opposed to local RA purposes?
Right. In this case, we're talking about a self-showing, right? So the IOU is self-showing to utilize that resource to be able to meet its system obligation. So you're correct.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to make sure, because it sounds like you're saying that there is a pretty good deal of certainty that RA would be used for system RA requirements as opposed to local RA requirements if it wasn't shown. I mean, obviously it's kind of strange in this case because the local RA requirements are now under the the framework of the CPE. But okay, thanks. I just wanted clarity on understanding your thought process on that.
Sure. Thank you. Simone, any other questions for me out there?
I don't see anything else.
Okay, I will cede the floor then. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric. I think we have Matt up next. Matt, are you on?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So first of all, I just want to note, been a lot of great presentations today, and I think what I'm going to present is pretty consistent with what we've heard already that the CP structure, there's some aspects of it that haven't been working very well, and in particular, the incentives for showing are pretty limited. So I have 10 proposals that I'll try to walk through in about 20 minutes, and some of them are small and some of them are large. But I think fortunately they're all pretty simple. So hopefully I'll be able to explain them quickly. And I especially looking at this slide now, I feel like I have to offer this disclaimer. When our slides got aggregated into this package, for some reason, my slides ended up looking exactly like the staff slides. So I just want to be clear that while Calpine would welcome Energy Division's support of its proposals, these are not Energy Division proposals, even though they're on Energy Division's slide template. So, I mean, you know, as other presenters have noted, the initial CP solicitations didn't go very well, and in particular, you know, PG&E missed the local capacity requirements by a large margin. There's limited information on what went wrong. You know, Rhett and provided some useful additional detail today, but I think as we've heard from other participants in the workshop, there's a lot more that we need to understand. So not really understanding what happened, you know, we put together a bunch of proposals based on our conjectures about some of the problems, and I'm gonna really try to respect you know, PG&E concerns about the confidentiality of its CP solicitation. So, you know, a lot of what I'm going to describe, or all of what I'm going to describe, is just, you know, based on public information or, you know, information that we see independent of our participation in any of the CP solicitations. So I'm going to offer some you know, fairly targeted proposals, but I think big picture, we're in line with CalCCA that we think some of these problems may not be fixable, and we definitely favor a reconsideration of you know, something like a residual structure instead of the hybrid structure that we have in place now. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So just in terms of the structure of the rest of the presentation, I'm just going to identify, you know, sort of certain problems that we see with the current CP structure, and then offer some potential solutions. So one of the problems that we see is that the CP decision gives the CP discretion to reject offers above the CPM price, and those number of people have noted today, prevailing system RA prices are really high right now, potentially above the CPM price in at least some months. And so, you know, just generally, we do not think that suppliers should be expected to sell local RA at prices below what they can get for system RA. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So I think, you know, one of our solution to this problem is to allow the CPEs to sort of do a more nuanced determination of cost effectiveness that's informed by prevailing prices of system RA. So there are all kinds of places from which that information could come, you know, potentially from broker quotes, or the price data that Energy Division referred to already today, or even potentially from the CP bundled affiliate with appropriate confidentiality protections. I'm also going to talk about this idea of the CP doing system for local swaps, and that might be another way that the CP could get data on sort of prevailing system RA prices. Next slide, please. I guess I should ask, are there any questions so far? There are none that I can see. Yeah, I'm gonna keep rolling then. Another general class of problems, and this has been touched on extensively today. There are very limited incentives for LSEs to show capacity to the CP. One reason for that Eric touched on, the LCR RCM credits are very low. There are a bunch of resources that aren't eligible for the LCR RCM credits, including gas, which makes up a lot of the local capacity. There's no incentive, even indirect, for an LSE outside of, say the PG&E TAC area to show PG&E local capacity, because that LSE will not benefit even from, sort of reducing the overall PG&E CP procurement costs. And then on top of all this, the showing process is unnecessarily complicated. And so an example of that, and I had a little bit of a dialogue with Rhett about this, but LSEs were required to provide detailed data on unit operating characteristics in order to show, and it's not clear to us that was actually necessary. Next slide, please. So a couple of solutions that might encourage LSEs to show. Well, one solution is to implement to reconsider the whole structure and implement a residual approach that doesn't involve showing. Under that approach, LSEs just actually count the capacity that they buy. Proposal number 3, we think that there may be sort of a mechanical problem with the way that the PUC is calculating the LCR RCM credits, and please, Simone or Natalie or Jamie, anybody else, weigh in if we have this wrong. But our understanding of the calculation is that it compares local prices to a megawatt weighted average of system prices. And the problem with that is, system RA purchases are more heavily weighted towards the summer months or towards the peak months. And so that tends to artificially push up the megawatt weighted average system price that goes into the calculation of the premium. And so I tried to illustrate this problem in this simple numeric example below that just has a couple of months, month 1 and month 2, and the system requirements are higher in month 2. And you can see, sort of reading across, that the local premium is actually the same in each month. So it's always $1 throughout the year. But based on these underlying monthly data, when you calculate the megawatt weighted average price over the whole year, you get $4. And you calculate the average local price over the whole year, and you get 450, and you actually end up with a lower than actual premium when you compare these two numbers. So, maybe that's a small tweak that could be made to the calculation of the premia. I mean, it may, probably won't make a huge difference to showing, given that, actually not very many resources are eligible for the LCR RCM. Stop there briefly. Are there any comments on that? Okay, next slide, please. Another change that might encourage more showing is to expand eligibility for the LCR RCM, particularly gas. And then, this fifth proposal is really, it wouldn't encourage showing per se, but it may be an alternative to showing, a different way for the CPE to secure local capacity. So we're proposing that the CPE be allowed to facilitate local for system swaps. This is something that all the utilities did in the pre-CPE structure. But so swaps involve essentially exchanges of system for local capacity. So for example, a supplier might offer in at not the price at which it's willing to sell local capacity, but the price at which it's willing to provide local capacity in return for equivalent megawatts of system capacity. The IOUs were able to do this before because they had system capacity in their books. For the CPE to do that, it would also have to solicit offers for system capacity to swap with local capacity. And I've tried to provide an example of how that would work. So, a supplier might have 100 megawatts of local that it would be willing to swap with the CPE for $1 per kilowatt month. There's another supplier that has 100 megawatts of system capacity. The CPE would take both offers and kind of pair them up, so it would end up paying $6 a kilowatt month for 100 megawatts of local capacity. You're paying $5 for system, and then $1 for the swap of local for system, and it would give back supplier one 100 megawatts of system. Just an idea. Next slide, please. This has already been discussed, but we sort of indirectly definitely observe some frictions associated with PG&E's requests for operating characteristics for capacity that was being shown, and we'd appreciate a lot more explanation on this, but it's not clear to us that a lot of this operating characteristic data is actually used or useful for the bid evaluation. And the problem is that these data are not typically included in RA only confirms. So that means, if we've sold capacity to an LSE, didn't include this operating characteristic data, they have to come back to us and get it. But that puts us in the place of sort of warranting certain operating characteristics, and that's not typically done in an RA only deal. And we might be reluctant to do that, especially if we don't understand how the data are going to be used. Next slide, please. You know, we've definitely observed that the CP structure has discouraged long-term contracting, and you know that may or may not relate to the CP procurement shortfalls, but generally we think that the you know, it's sort of the entire RA structure should encourage long-term contracting. It, you know, reduces risk for suppliers. It provides more certainty to loads. So that the structure, at least as it's been rolled out, discourages long-term contracting in a few ways. You know, first of all, perhaps most obviously, there's no clear incentive for load-serving entities to sign long-term contracts with local gas units if they cannot realize a local premium for those resources. And there's really no way for LCs to do that other than turning around and selling the capacity to the CPE. Yeah, they can't get the LCR RCM. They get some small indirect benefit, you know, if they show from lowering everybody else's CP procurement costs as well as their own. You know, they may still be interested in contracting local resources, a system RA, but there's no reason for LCs to contract local gas for the local attribute for any kind of term. You know, on top of that, both the Edison and PG&E CPs introduced restrictions on term, and you know, this is in their solicitation protocol. You know, really focusing their procurement on the prompt a year or two, and those restrictions were beyond what was required in the CP decision, and so we like the CPEs to you know, to use their full discretion to procure for some term. And then, you know, the other sorry, if you could go back one slide. Sorry, forward. Yes, thank you. One more. Yeah, and then just as Eric described, you know, the uncertainty about the allocations of system capacity from the CPE has also discouraged long-term contracting for system capacity, whether that's with resources in local areas or outside of local areas. So next slide, please. So some of the ideas that I already brought up might encourage long-term contracting. I mean, we think, you know, generally a residual structure would be better for long-term contracting. But some other things that could be done, you know, I started to get into this on the previous slide, but you know, the commission could discourage CPEs from including restrictions on term that are not clearly required by the CPE decision. And then, you know, I think this is teed up in the ruling that sort of opened this whole process. But we do support the ability of CPEs to do more bilateral contracting outside of solicitations, including for terms that go beyond the terms for which they're already clearly authorized to procure. So, you know, beyond sort of the 5-year window that was sort of translated to CP from you know, kind of bundled procurement rules. Next slide, please. A few other minor issues with CPE, and this is again like probably not necessarily explaining the huge shortfall in PG&E's procurement, but just things that didn't work well for us. The CPE doesn't clearly have authority to buy bundled renewable products, and that was an issue for us because the Geysers geothermal facility, our plant accounts for a lot of the local capacity in one of the PG&E local areas, and just because of the unique underlying economics, we strongly prefer to sell a bundled Geysers product that includes RECs and energy and RA. PG&E didn't clearly have the authority to procure that, so we think they should have the authority to procure that kind of product. One issue associated with that is, they'd have to figure out what to do with the energy and the RECs, and so maybe those could be allocated to all load serving entities, or the CP could monetize those somehow. Next slide, please. And then this is really minor, but the PG&E CP used an energy settlement contract rather than a standard toll. So this is this particular contract form puts a lot of risk on suppliers because the settlement is firm. It's not unit contingent. We have to settle this contract regardless of whether a plant can operate or not. Yet it is settled at LMPs that are specific to our resources, and particularly when a plant is down, that can have a big impact on the unit specific LMPs. And so just generally this structure is a lot riskier than a standard toll. And it's my understanding that Edison used more of a standard tolling agreement. And just generally we favor that approach if the CPs are going to continue to buy energy or dispatch rights. So thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Let's go to Mark Maranishi.
Yeah, this is Mark Maranishi with PG&E. Thanks, Matt, for the presentation. I just had one question on the proposal you had, number 6, in terms of the detailed information and operating characteristics for shown capacity. I just wanted to confirm, was that for kind of all resources, basically any bid resources and shown resources, or just the shown resources that you were referring to? I just want to clarify.
Well, I guess I could understand why you might want operating characteristics for a toll, but I'm not sure why you need them for either RA only that's offered to you, or RA that's shown to you. And if there's a good reason for that, we're all ears, but we don't understand it, and I just wanted to highlight for you that it definitely created some friction.
Got it. No, I appreciate that context, and I think we'll take that back. Appreciate the feedback. Just one clarification, at least for us. I do believe that for the shown resources, we did make a specific change to the forms we put out there requesting information related to operating characteristics based on market feedback. So I do think in advance of the offer deadline or the commitment deadline for shown resources, many of the operating characteristics, if not all of them, were not required to be submitted. So I just wanted to be sure, we flagged that for you as well.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that, and I heard about that. Thank you.
Let's see, Eric, your hand's been up for a while. Did you have another question?
No, I'm sorry, I don't. I will go put my
Just
hand down.
checking.
I apologize.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure. Don't see anyone else.
Okay, I think that we did have an addition to the agenda, a last minute addition, and that is comments or by Mary Lynch on behalf of Aram. So if Mary can step up and to the podium, we can unmute you, Mary. And thank you, Matt. We don't have slides for Mary, but I think she will speak to RM's comments or proposals. Mary, are you on?
You can unmute yourself.
There we go. There we go. Thank you. Can you hear me? Oh,
Yes, Mary.
okay, good, good. Okay, so I can be brief because some of ARM's comments mirror some of the things that Eric talked about earlier, Eric, with CalCCA. Specifically that this is particularly with regard to PG&E currently, that the fact that they have not procured the full local requirement creates a lot of uncertainty for non-IOU LSEs because we need to know what our system allocation is going to be from that procurement in order to move forward with planning to meet the rest of our system obligation that we'll have to meet. And so in that regard, we would echo what Eric said, that we would certainly hope that that procurement can be concluded before June of next year so that we can get our allocations and proceed with rounding out our system and flex purchases in time for the year ahead showing. However, if that isn't going to be possible and the CPE is going to trigger backstop procurement by the CalISO, then there needs to be some sort of accommodation to our showings for system and flex to reflect the fact that we won't know what the CalISO has done in the back with its backstop authority until after our showings are due. So we would like to see in some way to get, if backstop procurement is going to be triggered, we'd like to see that that gets accompanied by some kind of at least a good estimate to non-IOU LSEs what the quantity of that backstop is going to be, and that to the extent we have a system or a flex showing that is deficient by no more than that amount that we're expected to get in the backstop allocation, that there would be a waiver from all penalties associated with that sort of deficiency. And so I think in that regard, we echo what CalCCA said. There was one additional area, though, that we wanted to note, and that is that the CPE is going to be allowed, it looks like, to participate in the procurement of the emergency resources that have been authorized in the emergency proceeding. And we wanted to make the proposal, or we have made the proposal in our comments, that such procurement to meet the emergency, in the emergency procurement does not carry with it any allocation of RA attributes. So it seemed to us that the right way for that to work would be if the CPE is going to do any procurement to meet the requirements of the emergency proceeding, that it's only done after they've met the full local requirement that they are that they are supposed to meet as the CPE. Otherwise, it disadvantages us in terms of getting our allocated share. And then the other thing that we did want to see clarified is if the CPE, well, in its role in participating in the emergency proceeding, the order does say that the entity, that the CPE can do bilateral contracting. It wasn't clear to us, and we think it should be clarified, if the CPE can use backstop authority for, bilateral contracting authority to meet the emergency procurement only, or whether that bilateral authority is also intended to extend to the procurement that they're doing in their role as the CPE for local requirements. And that sort of summarizes our proposals. I'm happy to take any questions. Hearing none, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Okay, so we carved out this time to have a final Q&A session. Should parties have any questions on the proposals that were filed yesterday or the presentations today? So I just wanted to open up the floor to any questions. Okay, it's a pretty quiet group. I think hearing none, we will conclude. I just wanted to let everyone know we will have the recording of the workshop along with the presentations posted on our events and web conference page of the PUC website. Most of you know where that is. We will have that updated on the website in the next few days. In the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I think you have my email now. But thank you so much for all of the participants and for all of the panelists. We look forward to hearing and seeing your comments in the upcoming days. Thank you.
Thank you.